The war between Russia and Ukraine is now in its third month and it is not showing any signs of any kind of respite. In fact, if anything at all, the Russians have said there is no timeline to stop this war and they will continue indefinitely until their military objectives are achieved. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been gaining significant ground, particularly in Donbass, so much so it's pushing back the Russian offensive in some places right up to the Russian border. The question now is, what gives? And where does this war go from here? I'm now joined by a very special guest. Mark Esper is the former Secretary of Defense of the United States. Thank you very much. Let's start with the most recent happenings. We had just this past week the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky speak at the World Economic Forum, saying that Ukraine will not stop this fight until all of the territory that it's lost to Russia is recovered. We also had the Russian defense minister saying that they don't have any timelines for this war and it could go on forever. What is your assessment as to where this war stands 3 months since it began?
Well, first of all, it's been a strategic failure for Vladimir Putin on multiple fronts, militarily, politically, diplomatically, economically. What he has stoked has resulted in crushing economic sanctions on his country. We now see Ukraine more oriented toward the West. We see NATO unified, and we hopefully will see 2 new members of the NATO alliance join in the coming weeks and months. So it's been a massive failure for him. And what it also exposed was the weakness of the Russian military. And frankly, what was surprising for many of us was the tactical competence of the Ukrainian military and the leadership and grit and will of the Ukrainian people. So that said, I don't think it ends anytime soon. Putin has backed himself into a corner. It looks like it is grinding down into a war of attrition that will go on for months and months, if not years. And we just have to see how it plays out. Who will give up first? Who will relent? And with regard to President Zelensky and what he wants out of this, my view is we should take our cues from him and the Ukrainian people and not try to dictate some peace or some negotiated settlement from the outside.
When this war started 3 months ago, you said that the response from the Biden administration was somewhat shaky. What is your assessment now of how the White House has responded to this war? Has your assessment changed from back then?
Yes, I did initially thought it was mixed and sent the wrong signals. I did not like the fact that the White House took the military option off the table or that they didn't apply all the sanctions or made some distinction between a minor incursion versus a major one. But at this point in time, I think they've gotten a lot better. The White House has pulled together the NATO allies and have kept them in line. They're pushing a lot of supplies and material and weapons into Ukraine alongside our allies. So I think the response has been much better since the early days of the conflict.
But the Ukrainian government, President Zelensky himself, his other ministers, they've all been asking for more from NATO, including airspace closures, heavier weaponry, including air support, fighter jets from other NATO members, etc., none of which has been made available yet. So what do you make of that? Why has NATO not acceded to some of these requests from Ukraine?
Well, first of all, as Secretary of Defense, I made my top priority being to implement the National Defense Strategy. Our view was that we were in an era of great power competition. Our strategic adversaries would be first China and then Russia. And here we are 2 years, 3 years later, it's playing out that Russia has invaded a neighbor, something we hadn't seen at this scale since probably World War II. So I think the Ukrainians are fighting the fight that we prepared for, we the United States prepared for and never hoped we had to. And so I think the United States and its NATO allies should provide Ukraine with what it needs. Now, I also disagreed about the decision regarding MiG-29s. I think they should be provided to Ukraine. But I don't think at this point in time, NATO should get directly involved. At the end of the day, we're trying to narrow this conflict, not broaden it.
There's been some criticism of that policy as well, the fact that NATO has not got itself directly involved, and it's the Ukrainians who are actually been left to fight this fight. As one scholar recently said, America will be engaged in this war till the last Ukrainian soldier falls. So what do you make of that criticism? How do you respond to that?
Well, President Zelensky has said that his people are willing to fight the war, and they are doing so in great numbers with tremendous courage. What he has been asking for principally has been weapons and material, resources, logistics, and funding to keep his economy afloat as well. So, look, I think we are providing what they need. I still would never take a military option off the table because We don't know how horrendous this conflict may get. We don't know how far Vladimir Putin may go. We may reach a point where NATO decides it needs to get involved in one way, shape, or form. And so we should be prepared to do that if need be.
So, what, according to you, are Vladimir Putin's options right now? Because it seems like the war has reached a bit of a stalemate. The Russians clearly have not seen the kind of success that they were hoping for initially. They don't yet seem to be giving up. Just yesterday, and I referred to this earlier in the discussion as well, the Russian defense minister saying that they don't have any timelines for this war to end. How long do you think the Russians can continue fighting like this?
Well, first of all, they failed in phase one by not being able to seize the country, let alone Kyiv. And now we are in phase two, if you will. Before the war, they only had about 40% or so of the Donbass. We thought that they were going to try and seize the rest of that, but clearly they haven't been able to do that. They've made some tactical gains on the ground, but it seems like they seize a town or two and then the Ukrainians take it back. Now, they did manage to seize Mariupol in the south and consolidate their gains along the coastline with the Black Sea. My suspicion is that they, at some point, will claim a little bit more ground in Donbass and then declare victory by consolidating that land bridge between Russia, the Donbass, and Crimea. And that may be it, if you will. Now, that may not be what the Ukrainians want. The Ukrainian people have a voice in this, and they may say, no, we're going to continue to fight until we push Russian forces out of all of Ukraine, to include maybe Crimea, which I would support, of course, because I think sovereignty is an important thing, and President Zelensky needs to define that for his country.
You've written in your book, A Sacred Oath, Memoirs of a Secretary of Defense in Extraordinary Times, that you had repeatedly warned then President Donald Trump, your boss at that time, against withholding aid to Ukraine. Did he tell you why he was withholding that aid? And do you think that that was one of the reasons, if not directly, certainly in an indirect fashion, which emboldened Vladimir Putin to attack Ukraine?
Well, I did weigh in with President Trump on multiple occasions with regard to releasing the the security assistance. I tried any number of arguments to get him to do that, to include the fact that it was the law. But I did that alongside Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton, together or separately. None of us could figure out why. In fact, it wasn't until the story hit the newspapers, I think in early September, about this phone call between him and President Zelensky, that we finally knew the reason why. And that phone call happened a day or so after I came into office, so I was not aware of it at the time. But look, with regard to what impact that had, I think, first of all, President Trump deserves credit for providing the Ukrainians with lethal aid in 2017. That included the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which have been so critical to the fight. And I think it was important that he continued American training of Ukrainians in Lviv, Ukraine. I was there. I spent a couple of days there watching the training. All very good. I think those were very important to Ukraine's success on the battlefield. But with regard to the withholding of assistance, it happened for a few months. I don't think it had any material impact at this point in time on Ukraine's ability. So I don't think that's the case.
Many Republicans have also blamed Biden for indirectly encouraging, maybe not encouraging, but certainly being passive, if you will, and that's perhaps why Putin dared to invade Ukraine. They're also saying that Putin perhaps was emboldened after the entire fiasco of the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan last year. Do you agree with this assessment?
I do think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan by the United States in the summer of 2021 was a disaster. It really undermined our stature on the world stage. It affected our allies, and it just made us look weak. And that could have factored into it, for sure. It could have signaled that President Biden was not as committed. Of course, President Biden was vice president during the Obama administration when the first invasion of Ukraine happened in 2014. Maybe that played into it. But I think there may have been other factors as well. Keep in mind that Angela Merkel stepped down as chancellor from Germany in the fall of 2021. And she was arguably the leader of the EU, of Europe. Maybe that was another factor as well. So I think there were a number of things coming into play, but I certainly would not discount the two that you mentioned.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the Quad Summit, the second ever in-person Quad Summit that concluded earlier this week. There was this interesting comment made by the U.S. president when he was asked about whether America would get directly involved militarily if China were to attack Taiwan. And he said, of course they would. And then, of course, the White House had to backtrack on that comment. Is America's long-held policy of strategic ambiguity when it comes to the question of Taiwan a little less ambiguous now?
Well, absolutely it is. And this is the third time that President Biden stated very clearly that we would assist Ukraine in its defense. Now, I'm sorry, Taiwan in its defense. Now, he didn't specify what that means, right? And there's some ambiguity there, but that's always the case. He's put that option, that position on the table. And to me, it makes sense. I think strategic ambiguity has run its course since diplomatic relations changed in the 70s and the evolution of one China policy was adopted. So the countries have evolved, both China and Taiwan. And Taiwan is now a robust democracy. It has a strong economy, robust economy. It's a technological powerhouse. I think so many facts have changed, not least of which, by the way, is China continues to threaten Taiwan in numerous ways. And so I think the clarity is much needed. And I give President Biden credit for standing up to the Chinese and asserting that the democracies of the world will not let the autocracies of the world dictate the future.
You've also said time and again that you consider China to be the biggest threat to the United States and that they'd want to displace the U.S. by 2049 when the PRC celebrates 100 years of its existence. Given what we have seen in the Quad and the increasing pace and cooperation amongst these countries, do you see the Quad becoming the sort of preeminent grouping of nations to take on China? China, on the other hand, is calling Quad an Asian NATO. So do you foresee China trying to do with any of these countries something similar to what Russia did with Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I spent a whole chapter in my book about China, given that I do believe it's a strategic adversary of the United States and indeed for all democracies in the world. And I put a lot of time, a lot of pages talking about U.S.-Indian relations in this context as well. And so in my view, whether it's United States bilateral alliances, whether it's regional groupings like ASEAN, or whether it's the Quad, I think these are all very important in terms of standing up to the Chinese. And it doesn't have to be a confrontation with them. I think what we need to do is stand together and try and push them in a better direction, one in which they respect international rules and norms and behaviors. They abide by international law. Look, during my tenure, I read about this in the book. Their intrusion or invasion, whatever you want to call it, in the Himalayas against India was just was unprovoked and unjustified. And I felt it important that the United States support our Indian partners, which is why I reached out to my counterpart, Defense Minister Singh, on this matter. So I think the more forms, the more ways in which we can stand up to the Chinese and try and get them to head in a different direction, take a different approach, adopt different policies, all the better. And India is a critical player as the world's largest democracy to help do this. And I'd like to see them take more of a leadership role, in fact, in this regard.
You've written extensively about India in your book, and I just want to know your thoughts about, even within Quad now, for example, we're seeing India take a slightly different, slightly more nuanced position when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Even the joint statement that Quad put out did not mention Ukraine, even though President Biden did specifically talk about Ukraine and the Russian war there. The Indian Prime Minister has refrained from talking about Ukraine at Quad. So is it okay, according to you, that within a grouping of countries like the Quad, some countries take a slightly differing position on something as important as the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, look, on one hand, it is. I mean, every country has the right to the policies it wants, but frankly, I've been disappointed in the Indian government on this. I think they should stand firm. It should stand firm with the democracies of the world. Look, I understand there's a long-standing relationship between Moscow and New Delhi, but the fact is we got the autocracies of Russia and China are challenging democracies, international rules and norms. And those rules and norms have allowed many countries around the world to prosper and thrive and brought democracy and liberty and freedoms to many peoples. And I think we need India to stand with us on these issues. And so I've been disappointed in the position. I'd like to see a different take because, look, at some point in time, it may be authoritarian China doing something similar to India. And I think the Indian people, the Indian government are going to want the Western democracies to rally to their aid as well, their assistance as well. And so you got to think about it in those terms also.
And I'll come back to where we began, and that's the Russia-Ukraine war. So what is your assessment of the long-term implications, the long-term fallouts of this war? We are seeing this war bring Europe together in a way that we haven't seen in a number of decades. It's perhaps giving NATO a renewed sense of self-purpose, if you will. What may be the long-term implications of this war, according to you?
Yeah, I think you've hit on a couple of them already. I think NATO certainly has a renewed sense of purpose. I'm glad to see that. I think it'll be invigorated by two new members, Finland and Sweden, both of which will bring capability and geopolitical position to the alliance. I think the Russian economy is permanently damaged, and if not permanently, at least permanently capped in terms of what it will be able to do. Russia, except for its strategic might, its nuclear capabilities, is much less of a military threat than we thought it was. And then on the diplomatic front, I don't think that you'll see Vladimir Putin be invited to G8s or G20s or sitting down with his counterparts. So I think it's been disastrous for Russia, and I don't care as much about Vladimir Putin, but I feel for the Russian people who I suspect just want to live their lives and raise their families and go about their ways, but they're being dragged down by this autocrat, and it's bad. Now, I think the challenge for the West, particularly Europe, will be to hold firm and not weaken over time in terms of applying sanctions or political isolation to Vladimir Putin. And that'll be the challenge, because I suspect in some ways Putin is counting on that the Europeans will weaken over time.
All right, Mark Esper, as always, a pleasure speaking to you and trying to get a little bit more of your insights into what's been going on in this war and where you see this war progressing over the next few weeks and months. Thank you very much